Under a white Kansas sky, a disgraced veteran bought a condemned church for $3,800. He had lost his uniform, his home, and almost every reason to believe his name could be cleared. But his old German shepherd, Bear, refused to ignore what slept beneath the bell tower floor. What they found was not treasure, but a buried truth tied to broken bridges, old records, and a powerful man's lie. Soon, one forgotten church became the last place where memory could still breathe. And when the bell finally rang across the snow, the whole town had to decide whether truth was worth the cost. If this story touches your heart, tell me where you're watching from. Leave your thoughts below, and please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 5,000 subscribers so I can keep writing more meaningful stories for you. Winter made Millbrook, Kansas look kinder than it was. Snow lay over the wheat fields in a thin, clean sheet, softening the fence posts, hiding the ruts in the old county roads, and turning every abandoned thing into something almost holy. From a distance, even broken barns looked forgiven. Even rusted combines looked like sleeping beasts from some ancient farmyard myth, waiting for spring to breathe them back to life. Ethan Cole knew better. At 46, he had learned that white did not always mean pure. Sometimes it only meant covered. His home was a faded blue Ford van parked near the edge of town, behind a closed grain supply lot, where the wind came hard across the fields and rattled the loose side mirror like a nervous tooth. The van had 2 cracked vinyl seats, a camping stove, a folded cot, 3 plastic bins of tools, 1 duffel bag of clothes, and a German shepherd who took up more space than any creature with a conscience should. Bear lay stretched across the back, muzzle resting on Ethan's old field jacket, his black and gold coat dull with winter dust. He was 7 years old, broad-chested, heavy-pawed, and built like a promise that had learned to limp. His right ear was torn from a mortar fragment years ago, leaving it notched and slightly crooked, as if life itself had taken a bite out of him and Bear had decided not to complain. His muzzle had gone silver around the edges. His hips were stiff in the cold, but his eyes remained sharp, amber-brown and watchful, like 2 lanterns left burning outside a chapel door. Ethan sat in the driver's seat with a paper cup of gas station coffee warming his hands. The coffee tasted like burnt rope and old pennies, but it was hot, and in February, hot was a blessing one accepted without theological debate. "You know," he said, glancing into the rearview mirror, "for a dog who retired from military service, you have a poor understanding of personal space." Bear opened one eye. "That is not a rebuttal." Bear closed it again. Ethan smiled despite himself. It was small, the kind of smile that did not want witnesses. He wore the same red and black plaid jacket he wore almost every day now. It had been lined once, maybe proudly, but the cuffs were frayed, and the left elbow had a patch sewn on with thread that did not match. Beneath it, a gray thermal shirt clung to his broad shoulders. His jeans were dark at the seams and pale at the knees. His work boots, brown leather and salt-stained, were the only things he still maintained with anything like military discipline. Around his neck hung 2 old dog tags. One carried his name, the other was scratched so badly that the letters caught the light in broken fragments. He kept them beneath his shirt most days, close to the skin, where they could not be seen and could not be taken. Once Ethan Cole had built bridges, not metaphorical ones, not the kind people talked about in counseling rooms or church basements while stirring powdered creamer into weak coffee. Real bridges, temporary spans, Bailey systems, timber supports, steel plates over gullies, anything that could carry vehicles, men, equipment, and hope across places that did not want to be crossed. He had served in the Army Corps side of war, the part people rarely put on posters. No roaring speeches, no flags in slow motion, just measurements, mud, stress calculations, anchor points, and the terrible knowledge that gravity never forgave pride. He had believed in numbers then, load limits, sheer strength, soil conditions, tension, compression. If the math was honest, a bridge would stand. If one figure was falsified, if one bolt was wrong, if one report wore a clean uniform over a dirty truth, a bridge could kneel like a penitent giant and take good people down with it. The temporary bridge overseas had gone down in weather rough enough to give any investigator an easy headline. Wind, rain, softened bank, stress fatigue. A tragedy made of natural causes and convenient language. But Ethan had known the sound. Even now, years later, he could hear it in dreams. Not an explosion, not a dramatic roar, but a deep metallic complaint, a groan from inside the bones of the structure. A bridge did not simply fall. It announced its betrayal first. It spoke in strain and vibration. Ethan had heard that sound and turned before anyone else moved. Afterward, Colonel Thaddeus Reeves stood before panels and paperwork with his silver hair cut close and his voice polished smooth. He spoke of responsibility, command integrity, procedural deviation. He spoke as if truth were a tool one officer might issue to another and then recall before inspection. Ethan's name went into the report. Not Reeves, not the procurement chain, not the rushed orders, not the altered supply documentation, not the warning Ethan had filed and been told to reassess after deployment conditions stabilized. Just Ethan Cole, demoted, discredited, discharged in disgrace, though no one ever used that exact word to his face. People preferred cleaner phrases: administrative separation, loss of confidence, failure to maintain standards. Humiliation had many Sunday names. His marriage did not end all at once. It thinned first. Conversations became weather reports, then logistics, then silence. His wife had not been cruel. That almost made it worse. Cruelty could be fought. Exhaustion only sat down across from you at the kitchen table and admitted it had nothing left to give. The house went. Friends stopped calling. Former colleagues sent one or two messages, then let the distance become polite. Ethan became a man people remembered with lowered voices, as if his failure might spread by mention. Bear never changed. Bear had been there in the unit, trained to detect explosives, strange wiring, disturbed earth, chemical traces, and human tension when it rose too quickly in a room. He had walked beside Ethan through dust, rain, and heat. He had once refused to move from a culvert until Ethan listened, and that refusal had saved 3 men and a vehicle. Later, when Bear's ear was torn and his working days began to shorten, Ethan had fought to adopt him with the stubbornness of a man trying to keep one honest thing from being reassigned. Now Bear slept in the van, guarded the doors, tolerated Ethan's bad coffee breath, and asked no questions. He did not read service records. He did not care what a colonel had said. He did not require Ethan to explain why some nights he woke with both hands braced against the van wall, breathing as if the air had become too heavy to lift. Bear simply raised his head, pressed his warm skull against Ethan's knee, and waited until the world returned. That morning, the world returned slowly. The heater had quit before dawn, giving one final asthmatic cough and then surrendering to Kansas. Ethan had used half his remaining cash to fill the tank 2 days earlier. The van needed a new belt. His phone bill was due. Bear's food bin was low enough that Ethan had begun measuring each meal by eye and pretending he was not. He started the van, let the engine grumble itself awake, and drove toward town, with Bear sitting upright behind him, solemn as a retired judge. Millbrook's Main Street was 4 blocks of stubborn survival. A diner with a red sign, a hardware store that sold everything from snow shovels to wedding cards, a boarded movie theater, a library with warm yellow windows, a post office with a flag snapping hard in the wind. Ethan parked near the county notice board because the library did not open for another 20 minutes, and the library was warm. That was the kind of calculation his life had become. Not where to go, but where to be warm without being asked to buy something. The notice board stood under a small awning, crusted with ice. Flyers curled at the edges. Farm equipment auctions, church suppers, A missing barn cat named Mr. Pickles, who, judging from the photo, looked like he had left home intentionally and taken cash. Then Ethan saw the federal property notice. At first, he noticed only the price, $3,800. He read it twice because poverty had made him suspicious of small miracles. St. Aldrich Church, decommissioned rural property, North Millbrook Township, former parish structure, and associated land parcel. Federal asset disposal auction. Buyer assumes full responsibility for structural assessment, property taxes, access liabilities, environmental review, and maintenance obligations. That explained the price. Nobody was giving away grace. They were auctioning off trouble. A black and white photograph had been stapled to the notice. The old church stood alone in a wheat field beneath a winter sky. Its roof sagged slightly on one side. Several stained glass windows were broken. The bell tower leaned just enough for the eye to distrust it. Snow gathered along the stone steps, like folded linen. There was also a line printed in smaller type below the legal description. Belfry shall not be sealed, obstructed, or permanently enclosed prior to the third harvest season following transfer of ownership, per legacy trust provision. Ethan stared at it. "Well," he muttered, "that's normal." Bear, standing beside him now, sniffed the lower edge of the paper. "No, you may not eat federal property." Bear looked up at him, the pale patch above one eye giving him an expression of grave disappointment. Ethan should have walked away. A sane man would have. A man with savings might have laughed. A man with a house would not have paused long enough to feel anything at all. But Ethan stood there in the cold, reading the notice again. The church was not a gift. It was a liability with a steeple. The tower could swallow repair money. The land could be tied up in boundary disputes between the county, the old diocese, and whatever federal office had misplaced its responsibility for 40 years. The clause about the belfry sounded like something written by a lawyer who had been raised by crows. Still, he could not stop looking at the photograph. There was something in the old church's posture that embarrassed him with recognition. It had not collapsed. It had not been saved. It had simply been left standing in a field, too damaged to admire and too complicated to remove. Useless, the world had said. Ethan knew the stamp. Bear sat down beside him and leaned his shoulder against Ethan's leg. Not heavily. Just enough. Ethan looked down. "You like haunted real estate now?" Bear's tail moved once in the snow, dignified and slow. "Oh, don't give me that. You have terrible instincts. You once tried to make friends with a lawn sprinkler." Bear sneezed. Ethan laughed, and the sound came out rough, almost surprised by itself. Across the street, the diner door opened, and a woman in a tan wool coat stepped out carrying a paper bag. She was tall, sharp-featured, with black hair cut in a clean bob and boots too polished for Millbrook slush. She glanced toward Ethan, then at the notice board, then away with the quick assessment of someone trained not to appear curious. Ethan noticed her but thought little of it. Men who lived in vans learned to recognize when they were being categorized. 2 days later, he placed a bid. He told himself it was practical. He had tools, he understood structures, he could sleep under a roof, even a questionable one. Maybe the side room had a stove. Maybe the church had enough salvageable wood to make repairs. Maybe owning one broken thing would feel better than borrowing corners of the world from people who wanted him gone by morning. But the truth was less sensible. He wanted a place that had been judged and not yet erased. The auction was held online through a federal disposal portal with a design that appeared to have been last updated during the reign of dial-up internet. Ethan sat in the library using a public computer while Bear waited outside the front window, watching him through the glass like a parole officer. A few bids appeared early, then vanished into inactivity. No one wanted the obligations. No one wanted the belfry clause. No one wanted a rural church with a leaning tower, an unclear maintenance burden, and enough legal footnotes to choke a mule. Ethan entered $3,900. His hands hovered over the keyboard longer than they needed to. That amount was not nothing to him. It was food, fuel, repairs, medicine if Bear's hips got worse, weeks of survival folded into 4 digits. He clicked submit. Bear rose outside the window as if he had heard the sound through the wall. When the timer ended, Ethan sat very still. Winning bidder, Ethan Cole. For a moment he felt nothing. Then fear arrived, punctual as always. "What did you do?" he whispered to himself. Outside, Bear wagged his tail. "You are financially irresponsible," Ethan told him through the glass. Bear's mouth opened in a relaxed pant, which made him look insultingly pleased. The next morning, the woman in the tan coat found him before he found coffee. Ethan was parked near the grain supply lot, scraping frost from the windshield with an old plastic card, when a dark SUV pulled up behind the van. Bear stood immediately, visible through the rear window, his torn ear lifted. The woman stepped out carrying a slim leather folder. Up close, she looked early 40s, composed, elegant in a way that seemed less like vanity than armor. Her camel-colored coat was spotless. Her gloves matched her boots. Snow landed on her dark hair and seemed almost rude for daring. "Mr. Cole?" she asked. Ethan kept scraping. "Depends who's asking." "Lydia Marr, Meridian Federal Regional Development Authority." Bear gave one low breath through his nose. Not a growl. A notation. Ethan stopped scraping. Lydia offered a professional smile, warm enough to pass inspection, not warm enough to cost her anything. "I understand you acquired the St. Aldrich property." "News travels fast." "Public records do." She opened the folder. "Meridian has long-term development interests in that corridor. A new interchange could bring significant investment into Millbrook. Jobs, road access, commercial traffic. It could help the town." "Good for the town," Ethan said. "It could also help you." She removed a document and held it with both hands, careful not to let the wind take it. "We're prepared to purchase the property for 8 times your winning bid. Cash offer, expedited closing. You would be free of all maintenance obligations." 8 times. The number struck him harder than he wanted Lydia to see. With that money, he could fix the van, pay bills, rent a room for several months, buy Bear the joint supplements the vet had recommended, stop waking every morning to inventory his life by what might fail next. Lydia must have seen some flicker in his face because her voice softened. "Mr. Cole, properties like St. Aldrich can become a burden very quickly. Structural liability alone can ruin a private owner. This offer allows you to step away before that happens." Step away. People had been offering Ethan versions of that phrase for years. Step away from the panel. Step away from the unit. Step away from the house. Step away before your disgrace inconveniences anyone else. He took the document. Lydia handed him a pen. For a moment the world narrowed to practical things. Ink, paper, money, heat, dog food. A clean motel room with a door that locked. Maybe a week without the van's engine light glowing like a small red demon on the dashboard. Bear moved before Ethan did. The German shepherd stepped out of the open side door, walked to Ethan, and placed one heavy paw on the lower edge of the folder. Lydia looked down, startled. Bear did not growl. He did not bare his teeth. He simply stood there, black and gold against the snow, torn ear crooked, silver muzzle lifted, eyes fixed on Ethan. Not warning, not command. Question. If every unwanted place is sold, where do the unwanted go? Ethan looked from Bear to the paper. The old church rose in his mind, broken windows, leaning tower, snow on stone steps, still standing beneath a white Kansas sky. Not saved, not finished, not yet gone. He handed the pen back to Lydia. "No," he said. Her smile remained, but something behind it cooled. "You may want to think carefully." "I did." "This is a generous offer." "I know." "Then may I ask why you're refusing?" Ethan glanced at Bear, who had removed his paw from the folder and now sat in the snow with the solemn authority of a furry magistrate who had ruled on the matter. "Because," Ethan said, folding the paper and giving it back, "I just bought a church." The wind crossed the field and rattled the van mirror again. Lydia studied him for a moment as if deciding whether he was foolish, unstable, or simply inconvenient. Then she slid the document into her folder. "Very well, Mr. Cole. Meridian remains interested." "I'll alert the bishop," Ethan said. "There is no bishop." Then Bear. Bear sneezed directly into the snow. For the first time, Lydia's expression almost broke. Almost. She returned to the SUV and drove away, tires whispering over the icy gravel. Ethan stood beside the van, the cold working into his fingers, the dog tags resting against his chest beneath the plaid jacket. He had not won anything, not really. He had purchased a problem with a roof, a tower, and a legal clause that sounded like a dare from the dead. But as Bear leaned against his leg, warm and solid, Ethan felt something shift. Not hope. Hope was too bright a word, too clean. It was more like the first groan of a beam taking weight again. Painful, uncertain, real. He looked north, toward the fields where St. Aldrich waited under the snow. "All right," he said to Bear, "let's go see what kind of mistake we made." Bear wagged his tail once, and beneath the white Kansas sky, the man who had been told he could no longer be trusted drove toward the broken church that no one else wanted. Ethan Cole moved into St. Aldrich on a morning when the snow fell so lightly it seemed undecided. It did not storm. It did not rage. It simply drifted down over the Kansas wheat fields, covering the sleeping ground with a patient whiteness. The road north of Millbrook narrowed into two pale tracks between fences and low winter grass, and the old church waited at the end of it like a tired sentinel. St. Aldrich stood alone in the field, its bell tower leaning just enough to make a practical man frown, but not enough to make him run. The roof sagged over the north side. The stone steps had split down the middle, where ice had entered year after year and worked with the slow patience of a tax collector. A few stained glass windows remained, broken into red, blue, and green fragments that caught the morning light and scattered it over the snow like crumbs from a saint's torn robe. Ethan parked the Ford van near the side entrance and shut off the engine. For a moment he did not move. Bear sat in the passenger seat, broad chest forward, torn right ear angled toward the church. The German shepherd stared through the windshield with the solemn interest of an old soldier inspecting a new posting. "Well," Ethan said, "the good news is it has walls." Bear gave a soft huff. "The bad news is the walls have opinions." Bear stepped over the gear shift with all the grace of a collapsing bookshelf and nearly put one paw into Ethan's coffee. "Careful," Ethan muttered. "That's breakfast." Bear looked at him. "Don't judge me. Some men eat oatmeal. Some men drink gas station coffee and call it character development." He climbed out into the cold and stood with one hand on the van door. The air smelled of snow, dead grass, old wood, and something faintly mineral from the church stones. Behind him, the fields stretched white and quiet. Wheat stubble poked through in brittle rows, each stem bent beneath a cap of frost. The earth was not dead. Ethan knew that. It was only waiting beneath its covering. He wished waiting looked more heroic. The side door of the church resisted him. It had swollen with weather and neglect, and the old brass knob turned with the offended reluctance of something that had not been asked politely in years. Ethan put his shoulder to the frame, not hard enough to damage it, just enough to remind it that doors had a purpose. The door gave way with a groan. Cold air rolled out from inside. Bear entered first. He always did. The interior of St. Aldrich held a dim blue stillness. Dust lay over the pews. The aisle runner had faded to the color of dried roses. At the front, the altar remained in place, simple and cracked, with one long line across the stone like a healed bone. The old organ stood to the left, its wooden panels warped, its pipes dulled, its keys yellowed and uneven. Ethan stepped in carefully. Every board beneath his boots spoke back, not loudly, not dangerously. But the old floor had a language of complaint. Creak, settle, sigh, remember. He looked up. The rafters were exposed in places where ceiling plaster had fallen. A damp stain spread across the north corner, dark and feathered. One support beam near the side aisle had shifted slightly. The bell tower access rose from the rear through a narrow spiral stair, its iron railing rusted but still fastened at most points. Light fell through the broken glass in colored patches on the floor, weak but stubborn. To someone else, it would have been a ruin. To Ethan, it was a patient. He walked slowly, head tilted, eyes measuring what his hands had not yet touched. The bell tower leaned, yes, but the lean was old. The stones had settled unevenly, likely from frost heave and drainage failure along the west foundation. The roof leak over the north side was bad, but not final. The floor near the rear had some softness. 2 secondary beams needed temporary bracing. The side room might be habitable if he sealed the window and found a safer way to heat it. "Not dead," he said. His voice sounded strange in the church, smaller than it should have. Softer, too, as though St. Aldrich had swallowed enough loud men and preferred not to encourage another. Bear moved down the center aisle with his nose low, passing pew after pew. He did not act as he had in old deployment days. He was not tense, not working a scent grid, not freezing at every irregularity. He moved as if greeting residents who had been quiet for a long time. He sniffed the base of a pew, sneezed, then inspected a hymn book with deep seriousness. Ethan picked up the book and blew dust off its cover. A gray cloud rose. Bear sneezed again, harder. "That's fair," Ethan said. "The music department appears hostile." As if summoned by insult, wind entered through a broken pane and moved through the organ pipes. The instrument gave a sudden, wounded moan. Bear jumped backward, all 4 paws betraying him at once. Ethan laughed. It came out before he could stop it. Not the dry, guarded half-smile he gave the world. A real laugh, rough and surprised, and echoing up into the rafters. Bear turned his head sharply, offended to the marrow. The pale patch above one eye made him look like a judge considering contempt charges. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, still laughing. "I didn't know the ghost played baritone." Bear gave the organ a hard stare. The sound faded. The church returned to quiet. Yet the laughter stayed in the air for a moment, warm and impossible, like a match struck inside a cave. Ethan looked down at Bear and felt something in his chest pull tight. For months, maybe years, joy had reached him only as memory, a thing he could identify but not hold. Now here it was, absurd and small, born from a broken organ and a proud dog startled by holy indigestion. He put a hand on Bear's head. "Don't worry," he said. "I won't tell your old unit." Bear leaned into his leg, forgiving him with the reluctance of royalty. By noon, Ethan had unloaded the van. Tools first, always tools first. A toolbox, a folding workbench, 2 lanterns, extension cords, tarps, a socket set, a handsaw, a pry bar, a level, a tape measure, and 3 coffee cans full of screws sorted with a discipline he no longer applied to his own life. Then came the cot, sleeping bag, dog food, water jugs, 1 battered pan, and a box of clothes. He chose the small room behind the sanctuary as their temporary shelter. It had once been an office or robing room. The wallpaper had peeled in long strips. A cracked wooden desk sat against one wall. A narrow window looked out over the west field, where snow moved across the ground in pale veils. Ethan covered the window with clear plastic sheeting and tape. He set the cot away from the damp wall. He placed Bear's blanket near the door because Bear would choose the door anyway, and arguing with him was like arguing with a courthouse statue. Then Ethan began making notes. He worked with a carpenter's pencil and a small pad, moving through the church in slow loops. North roof leak. Temporary brace needed near side aisle. Check west drainage. Inspect tower stair before use. Seal broken panes before next. Hard freeze. Do not trust floor behind rear pews. At the last line, his pencil paused. Do not trust. He stared at the words longer than necessary. Trust had become a structural term to him. You trusted a beam after you tested it. You trusted a report after you verified the figures. You trusted a man only if his actions carried weight over time. Anything else was decoration. The front door opened before he heard a knock. Bear rose instantly. A woman stepped inside carrying a cardboard tray of coffee, a paper bag, and the air of someone who had never once waited for permission from a building. She was in her late 60s, short and round in a brown wool coat, with a purple knit hat pulled over white curls. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. A pair of round glasses hung from a chain at her neck, and a canvas library tote bumped against her hip. She looked like she might offer you cinnamon bread or uncover a property fraud before lunch. Possibly both. "Mr. Cole," she called. Ethan set down the pencil. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. I hate delivering food to the wrong abandoned church." She stepped carefully over a warped board. Though in this county, one can never be too sure. Bear stood between them, not threatening, simply present. The woman looked at him. "And you must be Bear." Bear's tail gave one slow sweep. "I'm Mabel Wren," she said. "Millbrook Public Library, local history, county records, town gossip, and occasionally emergency baked goods." Ethan blinked. "Emergency baked goods?" She raised the paper bag. "Cinnamon bread. Emergencies vary." "I didn't ask for help." "No, men rarely do until the roof has already fallen on them." Ethan almost smiled. Mabel walked farther in, looking around the sanctuary with a softness that did not suit her brisk voice. The old church seemed to recognize her. Or perhaps Ethan only imagined it because she moved through the dust without treating it like dirt. She touched the end of one pew lightly, the way people touched shoulders at funerals. "My mother sang here," she said. "Badly, but with conviction. The Lord appreciates enthusiasm, I'm told." Bear approached her tote bag and sniffed. Mabel looked down. "There may be one biscuit in there, but it is for emergencies." Bear sat. "Oh, don't start with me." She reached into the bag and produced a small dog biscuit. "This is not bribery. This is community relations." Bear accepted it with grave diplomacy. Ethan watched, unsure what to do with the sudden presence of kindness. Suspicion rose first, because suspicion always arrived early and wore sensible shoes. "Why are you really here?" he asked. Mabel handed him one of the coffees. "Because you bought St. Aldrich, and people in Millbrook will talk about you whether they know you or not. I prefer to know people before I become unfair." That a library policy? A personal failing? The coffee was hot and better than his usual. He wrapped both hands around it. Mabel looked up toward the tower entrance at the rear. "You read the Belfry Clause, I assume?" "Hard to miss." "Most people miss what matters if it's printed under enough legal language." "What does it mean?" She took a breath, and for the first time her briskness thinned. "Depends who you ask. The county says it's a legacy trust provision. The old diocese says it predates their final transfer. The federal office says with great confidence that somebody else should know." "That sounds official." "Oh, extremely. The government is never more confident than when pointing across the hall." Bear had settled beside Mabel as if she had passed a preliminary moral inspection. Ethan noticed that and did not like how much it influenced him. Mabel walked to the nearest pew and brushed dust from the seat before sitting. "Reverend Elias Rook wrote that clause. At least, most of us believe he did." The last pastor? Pastor, yes, but not only that. She looked toward the cracked altar. Before he came here, Elias Rook was a civil engineer. Bridge inspections, road projects, federal contracts. This was back in the 80s when men smoked in offices, reports lived in metal cabinets, and half the county still believed a handshake could hold up a roof. Ethan said nothing. Mabel noticed. Her eyes sharpened behind the round lenses she had lifted to her nose. "You were an engineer?" "Army engineer." "Ah." She nodded once, not with pity, but with understanding of category. "Then you know buildings remember things." He looked at her. She continued. "Elias used to say a structure tells the truth long after people stop. A wall bows, a foundation sinks, a beam twists. You can call it weather if you like, but the wood knows what happened." The words entered Ethan quietly and stayed. Mabel took a sip of coffee. St. Aldrich was once the center of this part of the county. Weddings, funerals, suppers, storm shelter, Christmas pageants with costumes that should have been crimes against fabric. Then people moved closer to town, roads changed, farms consolidated, the church emptied. And became cursed? Only according to people who prefer curses to paperwork. Mabel's mouth tightened. 3 different owners or caretakers after Elias tried to make use of this place. One went broke after a lawsuit over access roads. One was pressured to sell surrounding acreage. One gave up after a safety order made repairs impossible to afford. Nothing supernatural, just expensive misfortune wearing a long coat. Ethan thought of Lydia Marr's smooth voice. Meridian remains interested. "Who wanted the land?" he asked. Mabel's eyes held his for a moment. "Developers, agencies, people with maps larger than their consciences." Then, as if she had said too much too soon, she stood and brushed her coat. "But I'm an old librarian, Mr. Cole. We are legally required to sound ominous before noon." Ethan looked toward the tower stairs. "And the third harvest?" "Elias grew up on a farm. He marked time by planting and cutting, not quarters and fiscal years. Some say he wrote it that way because he trusted wheat more than officials." "That's not an explanation." "No?" Mabel smiled faintly. "But it is very Kansas." Outside, the snow slowed. Light entered through the broken glass and laid red and blue fragments over the pews. For a second, Mabel's purple hat, Bear's gold-black coat, Ethan's red plaid jacket, and the colored light made the church look almost alive. Not repaired, not safe. Alive. Mabel left after an hour, but not before giving Ethan a list of names. Roofers who might barter, a retired electrician who still answered the phone if called before supper, and a hardware clerk who would extend store credit if Ethan did not act proud and stupid about it. At the door, she paused. "People here don't believe in miracles much anymore," she said. "We've had too many committees for that, but they do notice when something refuses to fall down." She glanced at Ethan, then at Bear. "Try not to disappoint the architecture." After she drove away, the church felt different. Not friendly, not exactly. St. Aldrich was still cold, cracked, and full of places where money would vanish like water into dry soil. But it was no longer anonymous. It had belonged to mothers who sang badly, to farmers who measured years by harvest, to a strange reverend engineer who trusted structures to tell truths people buried. By evening, Ethan had braced the worst section of the side aisle with temporary supports. He worked until his fingers went numb inside his gloves. Bear followed him for a while, then took up position near the office door, watching the sanctuary with the tired dignity of a security chief on unpaid overtime. When wind slipped through the broken windows, the old organ groaned again. Bear lifted his head. "Stand down," Ethan said. "It's just the choir." Bear gave him a look of profound concern for his judgment. They ate supper in the back room, canned soup warmed on the camping stove, 2 slices of Mabel's cinnamon bread, and Bear's measured bowl of food, with a few forbidden crumbs added by a man who loudly denied doing so. Night settled early over the fields. The snow stopped entirely after 9. Clouds thinned. Moonlight spread over the white ground until the world outside the little window glowed blue and silver. St. Aldrich creaked in the cold. The plastic over the window trembled. Somewhere in the walls, old wood adjusted itself to the dark. Ethan lay on the cot in his clothes, boots placed within reach, dog tags cold against his chest. He had meant to sleep lightly. Instead, exhaustion dragged him down before he could finish worrying. He woke because Bear was standing, not pacing, not whining, standing. The German shepherd's body was rigid in the doorway, head lowered, torn ear angled forward. Moonlight touched the silver around his muzzle. He was looking toward the sanctuary. Ethan sat up slowly. "What is it?" Bear did not bark. That was what made Ethan's mouth go dry. In the old days, Bear had barked at men approaching too fast, growled at bad tempers, sneezed at dust, and once howled with personal outrage at a harmonica. But when something lay hidden beneath ground or wall, something wrong enough to require stillness, Bear became silent. That silence had saved lives. Ethan reached for his flashlight and followed him. The church at night was not frightening in the childish sense. No shadows leapt, no ghostly choir gathered beneath the rafters. It was simply large, cold, and awake in a way old buildings became awake when humans stopped making noise. Bear moved down the aisle, not hurried, nose close to the floor. He passed the pews, ignored the altar, ignored the organ, and went to the rear where the spiral stair curled upward into the bell tower. There he stopped. At the base of the stairs, near the first iron post, he lowered his muzzle to the floorboards. He sniffed once, then again. Slowly, deliberately, he folded himself down across a single plank, darker than the others. Ethan crouched beside him. The board was not dramatically marked. No symbol, no carved warning, no convenient ring handle waiting for a hero. It was only a little different in color, as if replaced long ago by someone careful enough to avoid attention, but not careful enough to fool a dog. Ethan pulled off one glove and placed his palm flat against it. Cold. Colder than the boards around it. He shifted his weight and pressed near the edge. The sound beneath was wrong. Not rot, not solid foundation. Hollow. Bear remained still, his body stretched across the plank like a living seal. Ethan looked at the spiral stair, then at the board, then at Bear. The church seemed to hold its breath. He whispered, "What did you find?" Bear's amber eyes lifted to his. No answer came, of course. No miracle. No voice from the rafters. Only an old dog, an old church, and a patch of floor that did not belong to the silence around it. Ethan set the flashlight beside the plank. Then he reached for the edge of the board. Ethan did not pull up the plank right away. He stayed crouched beside it, palm flat against the cold wood, listening to the quiet beneath the floor. The church around him seemed larger at night, not because anything had changed, but because darkness had a way of moving walls farther apart. Moonlight lay in pale strips across the pews. The broken stained glass colored the floor in faint bruises of red and blue. Bear remained stretched across the darker board, heavy and still. In the old days, Ethan would have called for a second man, marked the spot, secured the area, checked for secondary hazards, tested the air, and followed procedure with the stiff devotion of someone who knew procedure existed because people had learned pain the hard way. But this was not a deployment road. There was no team waiting behind him, no radio on his vest, no command voice in his ear. There was only an abandoned church, an old dog, and a man who had bought a problem for less than the price of a used snowmobile. "You understand," Ethan whispered. "This is exactly how people in horror movies make poor life choices." Bear did not move. "Fine. We'll make them professionally." Ethan stood, went back to the small room, and returned with his tool roll, flashlight, work gloves, and a flat pry bar. He also brought 2 short boards and placed them across the nearby floor joists to spread his weight. He did not trust the old flooring. St. Aldrich might have been holy once, but holiness did not cancel rot. Working slowly, he slid the pry bar under the edge of the plank. The first nail resisted. The second gave with a soft, dry squeak. He moved carefully, lifting just enough to avoid splitting the wood. Whoever had hidden this board had done it well. The nail heads were darkened, the grain matched closely, and the seams had been rubbed with old dust until they disappeared into the surrounding floor. Bear rose only when the board came loose. Beneath it was not dirt. It was a recessed iron ring set into a square wooden hatch. Ethan sat back on his heels. "Well," he said softly, "that's less drafty than I expected." Bear sniffed the edge of the hatch, then stepped backward, giving Ethan room. It was a small gesture, but it carried the old rhythm between them. The dog found. The man opened. Neither one had to explain his part. The hatch was heavier than it looked. Its hinges complained in a low, stubborn voice, and a smell rose from below: cold concrete, metal, stale air, dry paper, and the deep mineral dampness of a place that had not spoken in years. Ethan aimed the flashlight down. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Not a ladder. Not a crawl space. A proper set of poured concrete steps, steep and close-walled, leading beneath the foundation of the church. The beam of light caught the left wall, the edge of a steel handrail, and dust layered thick on each step. Ethan felt the hair rise along the back of his neck. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Men had built this, not farmers hiding whiskey, not teenagers making trouble. The stair was too deliberate, the walls too clean in their old geometry. This was infrastructure. Hidden, forgotten, but engineered. He clipped the flashlight to his jacket, tied a cord from his tool bag to the handrail near the hatch, and tested the first step with one boot. Solid. The second. Solid. Bear tried to follow. "No," Ethan said. Bear froze, offended. "One at a time. If the stairs give, you can write the incident report." Bear's expression suggested he would write it better. Ethan went down first. The cold increased with each step, not the sharp cold of winter wind, but the buried cold of the earth. The air pressed close. His breath sounded too loud. At the bottom, the stair opened into a rectangular room lined with concrete walls. The ceiling was low enough that Ethan, at 6'2", had to lower his head near the beams. He swept the flashlight slowly across the space. It was a shelter. A real one? Old metal shelves lined the right wall. A hand-crank radio sat on a table beside a stack of yellowed instruction pamphlets. A small generator crouched in the corner beneath a cover stiff with dust. There were empty water cans, a dented first aid tin, a crate of rusted tools, and several shelves of canned goods, so old their labels had faded into ghosts. Along the far wall, a round ventilation pipe ran upward at an angle, disappearing into the ceiling. Toward the left side of the room sat the boxes. Not many at first glance, 8 or 9, maybe 12. Rectangular storage boxes wrapped in dark oilcloth and tied with twine. Each one had a paper tag sealed under cloudy tape. Ethan stepped closer and brushed dust from the nearest tag. Rook. Inspection. Copies. 1979 or 1983. The name did not surprise him. Still, it made the room feel occupied. Elias Rook had been dead for years, yet suddenly he was not only a story told by Mabel Wren over coffee and cinnamon bread. He had hands, habits, fear, a system. He had wrapped these boxes as if preparing them for a flood, a fire, or a future that might not arrive in time. Above, the floor creaked. Bear's head appeared at the top of the stairs. "I said wait." Bear's tail thumped once against the upper floor. That is not waiting. That is supervising. Ethan turned back to the boxes, but after a moment, he sighed. All right, slowly. Bear descended with careful dignity, each paw placed as though the stairs belonged to a very old king who might take offense. When he reached the bottom, he sneezed at the dust, sniffed the air, and immediately moved to stand beside Ethan. The shelter seemed smaller with both of them in it. Ethan pulled a box onto the metal table. The twine broke stiffly under his fingers. The oilcloth unfolded with a dry whisper. Inside were drawings. Not church drawings, not parish records. Bridge plans. Ethan lifted the first sheet and spread it gently. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the ink remained sharp. Elevation lines, load notes, reinforcement schedules, foundation details, a county bridge in Nebraska, a culvert replacement in Iowa, a federal access road in northern Missouri, project codes, contractor names, inspection stamps. His body understood the documents before his mind accepted them. He turned to the next folder. Inspection variance, material substitution, concrete batch discrepancy, fastener certificate mismatch. Ethan read faster. At first it was only technical unease, the kind that gathered in the stomach of a man who knew numbers were not misbehaving by accident. A missing certification here, a revised load table there, a handwritten note questioning steel grade, a photograph of a cracked abutment, a letter requesting retesting, another letter closing the request without retesting. Then came the invoices. The approved invoice listed one grade of steel. The delivery slip showed another. The inspection report claimed compliance. A margin note in blue pencil disagreed. Not weather, not settlement. Count the bolts. Ethan stared at the handwriting. The letters were tight, controlled, almost elegant. A man trying very hard not to let anger ruin his clarity. He opened another folder, then another. The shelter stopped being a room. It became a map. Across the Midwest, in the years when hair was bigger, reports were typed, and men in offices still believed paper could be buried forever. Certain bridges and road structures had gone into service weaker than their drawings promised. Not every project, not every failure. Enough to form a pattern only someone patient, technical, and deeply unwelcome would have traced. Steel ordered at one grade and installed at another. Concrete mixtures with reduced cement content. Anchor bolts short of specification. Settlement readings adjusted between draft and final reports. Weather blamed where workmanship had been quietly wounded first. Ethan leaned both hands on the table. The old shelter seemed to tilt around him. He had seen bad work before. Every engineer had. Mistakes happened. Weather changed. Soil lied. Workers hurried. Supervisors missed things. But this was not simple failure. This was repetition. Correction avoided. Questions closed. Reports polished until they reflected the face of whoever paid for them. He found a folder tied with red string. Its tag read, Ghost Bridges. For a long moment, he did not open it. The phrase sat in his hand like something alive. Bear nudged his wrist with a cold nose. Ethan looked down. You don't get a vote on this one. Bear nudged him again. All right, one vote. He opened the folder. Inside were photographs, not graphic, not theatrical. Just sad in the way broken infrastructure was sad. A collapsed span half submerged in brown water, a buckled roadway under winter ice. Concrete cracked like old bread, twisted guardrails. Men in hard hats standing with their arms folded, looking small beneath the consequences of someone else's numbers. On the first page, Elias Rook had written in blue pencil, "A bridge does not fall on the day it drops. It falls on the day the truth is removed from the design." Ethan sat down on a metal stool that complained under him. The words struck too close. He had spent years remembering the temporary bridge overseas as an event, one cursed day among many. But bridges had long memories. They carried the sins placed into them long before wheels touched their decks. A weak span did not suddenly become weak when the rain began. Rain only revealed what pride had hidden. Ethan turned the page. A contractor name appeared again and again. Ardham Civil Supply. He did not know it. But in the next box, under later clippings and corporate filings, he found a note connecting Ardham to a consolidation group, then to Meridian Infrastructure Holdings, and finally to the public-facing agency name Ethan had heard from Lydia Marr's clean, careful mouth. Meridian. The air in the shelter felt thinner. Ethan stood and paced 3 steps, then stopped because there was nowhere to pace. Bear watched him, ears uneven, eyes alert. "No," Ethan said quietly. "No, no, no." But paper had no mercy. He kept reading. A signature appeared on a final inspection approval from 1982. Harlan V. Reeve, Chief Structural Engineer. Ethan read the name once, then again. Reeve. The letters seemed to darken under the flashlight. He knew that name because he had once heard Colonel Thaddeus Reeve mention it at a formal dinner overseas. His grandfather, Harlan, had been one of the men who built modern roads through the heartland. Reeve had said it with the polished pride of a man displaying a medal that had never been pinned on him. Harlan Reeve, Chief Structural Engineer. The signature appeared again on a revised settlement report, again on a material acceptance form, again beneath a line stating that no further investigation was recommended. Ethan felt cold move through him that had nothing to do with the underground room. He wanted the connection to stop there. A bad grandfather, a dirty old company, history with teeth, but not necessarily teeth in his own flesh. Then he found the newer folder. It was not wrapped like the others. It had been placed inside a metal document case at the back of the shelf where the ventilation pipe met the ceiling. The papers inside were copies, not originals, printed years after the oldest files. Procurement summaries, contractor relationship charts, news clippings about federal redevelopment authorities, shipping records from subcontractors. One name appeared in a list of defense-adjacent material suppliers. Meridian affiliated. Another sheet carried a handwritten note, not in blue pencil this time, but black ink, likely much later in Rook's life. Foreign temporary span failure may connect through supply chain. Army report closed too quickly. Officer Reeve involved. Grandson? Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. The shelter hummed around him, though nothing inside it was running. He saw the bridge again, not as memory usually gave it to him, in broken flashes and noise, but as a set of specifications. Weight, stress, timing, materials. His own warning routed up the chain and returned without action. Reeve's face afterward, solemn before the panel. The language of blame placed carefully, like charges set beneath a man's life. If these papers were true, then Ethan hadn't merely failed to hold up a bridge. He had been placed beneath one already designed to fall. The thought did not bring relief. That surprised him. For years, some secret part of him had prayed for proof that he had not been the weak point. He had imagined vindication as a sunrise, as clean water, as a hand reaching down to pull him from under all those reports. But now, faced with the possibility, he felt no triumph. Only grief. Because if he was innocent, then the world had been crueler than he had allowed himself to believe. If he was innocent, then the years he had spent hating himself had been years stolen with a stamp, a signature, and a practiced voice. If he was innocent, then the man he had become, the one who slept in a van and apologized to empty rooms, had been built from someone else's lie. His hands began to shake. He set the paper down before he damaged it. Bear moved closer. Ethan tried to speak, but the first sound failed. He laughed once, bitter and quiet, because some part of him still wanted to make the pain smaller by mocking it. "Congratulations," he whispered. "We bought a church and found a lawsuit." Bear pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg. The pressure was firm, familiar, grounding. Ethan sat back on the stool and covered his mouth with one hand. He had not cried when he signed the final divorce papers. He had not cried when he packed the last box from his house. He had not cried in the parking lot after the Army released him into civilian life with a folder of benefits he was too ashamed to open. But under St. Aldrich, in a Cold War shelter built to survive imagined endings, Ethan Cole finally broke in a very quiet way. No great sobs, no dramatic collapse, just water in his eyes, breath caught in his chest, and his shoulders bending as though an invisible load had at last found the joint where he was weakest. He was ashamed of it immediately. That, too, was old training. Bear did not allow shame much room. The German shepherd pushed his silvered muzzle under Ethan's hand and licked the dust from his knuckles. Then he gave a long sigh, the kind only old dogs and old men could make, and lowered himself onto the folder marked Ghost Bridges. Ethan looked at him through blurred vision. "You know that's evidence, right?" Bear blinked. "You can't just sit on evidence." Bear settled more heavily. Ethan wiped his face with the heel of his hand. A cracked laugh escaped him, half grief, half surrender. "Fine," he said. "Guard it, then." The shelter held them in its cold concrete silence. Above them stood the church with its cracked altar, warped organ, leaning tower, and broken windows catching moonlight. Around it lay the wheat fields, sleeping under snow. Beneath it sat the buried work of a dead engineer pastor who had feared men with clean signatures more than storms. Ethan reached for the nearest file again. This time, he did not read like a man searching for rescue. He read like a man measuring a damaged bridge, careful not to trust the first thing that looked solid. Page by page, name by name, the dead began to speak in inspection stamps, invoices, photographs, and blue pencil. And Bear, old soldier of the winter floor, kept watch over the ghost bridges, as if the truth were a wounded thing that might still be saved. By morning, the files from the shelter had stopped looking like discovery and started looking like weight. Ethan spread them across 3 pews in the sanctuary, using old hymnals to hold down curling corners. The winter light came through the broken stained glass in thin pieces, painting the reports with red and blue wounds. Bear sat near the center aisle, watching him with that grave patience dogs reserved for humans who believed staring harder at paper might make the world kinder. It did not. Ethan had slept perhaps 2 hours, and poorly. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw signatures: Harlan Reeve, Ardum Civil Supply, Meridian. Then, beneath those names, the bridge overseas rose again in his mind, not as flame, not as chaos, but as math with a hole in it. He could not simply walk into town waving decades-old files and expect anyone to believe him. A man like Colonel Thaddeus Reeve would know exactly how to answer. He would not shout. He would not panic. He would use the clean instruments of reputation: former soldier, discharged under a cloud, bitter, isolated, living in a condemned church, claims to have found a conspiracy under the floor. Ethan could almost hear the words before Reeve ever said them. He gathered one folder, then another, then stopped when his hands began moving too fast. Evidence had to be treated better than anger. Evidence was a bridge, too. If he placed one beam wrong, the whole thing could fall before it carried anyone across. By noon, Mabel Wren arrived in her small station wagon, tires crunching over the snow crust. She came in without knocking, which Ethan was beginning to suspect was not a habit, but a philosophy. She found him standing over the pews, unshaven in spirit if not in face, his clean jaw tight, his red and black plaid jacket dusted with gray from the shelter below. Mabel looked at the files. Then she looked at him. "Well," she said, setting down a paper sack, "you've either found the world's dullest treasure or the reason this place never sold." Ethan did not smile. That made her expression change. "What is it?" He handed her one of Elias Rook's notes. Mabel slipped on her round glasses and read in silence. The brisk humor drained from her face, leaving something older and more careful behind. "Oh, Elias," she whispered. You knew him? As much as anyone knew him near the end. She lowered the page. He came into the library every Thursday, asked for federal registers, engineering journals, old newspapers. Never borrowed fiction. I told him that was a moral failing. What did he say? That fiction required too much trust. Ethan looked at the rows of paper. He trusted this. No, Mabel said softly. He preserved it. That's not the same thing. She read more. Slowly now. The sanctuary held its breath around them. When she finished, she folded her glasses and placed them into her coat pocket with unusual care. You cannot take this to the sheriff first. Ethan looked up. Why? Because half of Millbrook wants that highway interchange, not because they're bad people, because the grain elevator cut shifts, because the feed store barely made payroll last month, because daughters and sons grow up and leave, and old towns start praying to asphalt the way they used to pray for rain. There are no children in this story, Mabel, Ethan said dryly, fatigue sharpening his voice. She gave him a look over the top of her glasses. Then let us say grown sons and grown daughters, Mr. Literal. My point stands. Bear sneezed, perhaps in support of legal clarity. Mabel turned back to the files. If you go public too soon, Meridian will bury you under words. You need someone who speaks in numbers. I speak in numbers? You speak in numbers with haunted eyes. That may be accurate, but it is not always persuasive. Ethan almost objected, then found he could not. Mabel took one of the boxes and tucked it against her chest. We're going to see Nora Whitcomb. I don't know Nora Whitcomb. Nobody knows Nora Whitcomb. Nora allows people to be aware of her existence. That was how, an hour later, Ethan found himself following Mabel's station wagon down a road that ran parallel to the old rail line east of town. Snow lay in dirty ridges along the tracks, and the wind carried the long, hollow sound of open country. Nora Whitcomb lived in a cedar-sided house with a steel roof and no decorative nonsense. The porch had been shoveled to the exact width of the door. A stack of firewood stood under a tarp, squared so neatly it looked engineered. Beside the steps sat a pair of black work boots, clean of mud but scarred at the toes. The woman who opened the door was tall and lean, in a dark turtleneck and gray wool vest, with silver hair cut blunt at her jaw. She had the kind of face that did not welcome excuses indoors. Her eyes were brown, sharp, and immediately busy, measuring Ethan, Bear, the file box, and Mabel's unnecessary cheer. No, Nora said. Mabel smiled. Good afternoon to you, too. I know that look. You brought me either a stray person, a lawsuit, or a roof problem. All three, depending on how poetic you feel. I don't feel poetic. You never do. That's why we admire you from a distance. Nora's gaze shifted to Ethan. You're the man who bought St. Aldrich. Yes, ma'am. Bad purchase? I'm aware. Being aware doesn't improve the purchase. No, ma'am. Bear stood beside Ethan, quiet and upright, his torn ear catching the pale light. Nora looked at him a second longer than expected. And this? Bear. Does Bear understand structural liability? Better than most committees, Ethan said. One corner of Nora's mouth moved, but not enough to be called a smile. She stepped aside. 10 minutes. Her office occupied the back room of the house, facing the railroad tracks. It smelled of coffee, paper, wood smoke, and old drafting film. A large table sat beneath a hanging lamp. Rolled plans stood in metal bins. A yellow laser measure lay beside a black notebook, and a framed photograph on the wall showed a younger Nora beside a broad-shouldered man in a hard hat and work coat. Both of them were laughing at something outside the frame. Below the photograph, on a peg, hung the man's old canvas work jacket. Bear noticed it before Ethan did. The dog moved toward it slowly, nose lifted. He sniffed once, then sat down in front of the jacket with unexpected solemnity, as if reporting to a fallen member of a unit no one had officially named. Nora went very still. Mabel stopped unpacking the files. Ethan opened his mouth to call Bear back, but Nora raised one hand. For several seconds, no one spoke. The wind touched the windows. The old tracks outside gleamed under snow. Bear sat before the jacket, silver muzzle lowered, his body calm and respectful. Nora turned away first. She did not cry. She only looked out the window and said in a voice scraped thinner than before, "He's more polite than most engineers I've known." Ethan swallowed. "He charges consulting fees and biscuits." A quiet sound escaped Nora. Not quite laughter. Not yet, but close enough to change the room. She sat at the table and pulled the nearest file toward her. "Show me." Ethan did. He did not tell her the story the way an injured man tells it, all heat and accusation. He forced himself to present the documents like a field assessment. Project code, material discrepancy, inspection signature, failure report, weather explanation, repeated contractor, revised settlement readings, missing retest. Nora interrupted often. "Where did you find the draft?" "Under St. Aldrich." "Original or copy?" "Mixed. Some carbon copies, some certified copies, some later printouts." "Chain of custody? Bad. At least you know that." She examined the drawings with a small magnifier from her desk. She traced load tables with one finger. When she reached a handwritten correction on a concrete batch report, her expression lost its skepticism and gained something much colder. "That's not a clerical mistake," she said. "No." She turned another page. "Whoever changed this knew what they were changing." "Yes." Nora did not look at him. "Do not say yes too quickly. I dislike being agreed with before I'm done being angry." Mabel, seated near the bookshelf, murmured, "And yet we cherish you." Nora ignored her with practiced skill. For nearly 2 hours the table became a trial without a judge. Nora sorted, questioned, rejected, returned, compared. Ethan answered what he could and admitted what he could not. Bear eventually lay near the old work jacket, head on his paws, as if guarding both the past and the room from foolishness. At last, Nora sat back. "I don't believe your whole story," she said. Ethan felt something sink. Then she tapped the reports. "But I believe these documents deserve to be feared." That was not comfort. It was better than comfort. Mabel spent the next 3 days moving like a cheerful smuggler of memory. She pulled old newspapers from microfilm at the library, searched county land records, copied articles from regional archives, and wrote names on index cards in her tidy schoolteacher handwriting. Each afternoon she came to St. Aldrich with a new stack of forgotten things. A truck driver named Howard Bell had survived a bridge settling incident in 1986 and had been told not to discuss pending review matters. A farmer, Dale Pritchard, had lost a grain storage shed when a road approach failed after a winter thaw. The compensation had been small and wrapped in language thick as molasses. A crew of road workers had signed silence agreements after a retaining wall shifted during repairs. All adults. All old enough now to have learned that truth, if ignored long enough, became part of the weather. Ethan listened to their names as Mabel read them aloud from the pews. The church seemed to gather each one, not dramatically. No thunder shook the rafters, no bell rang. But St. Aldrich felt less empty with every name spoken. Its cold air filled with the outlines of people who had carried doubts for years and been told to set them down. Nora visited twice, each time with her yellow laser measure, black notebook, and the impatience of a woman who considered vague statements a public health hazard. She inspected the hatch, the shelter, the ventilation pipe leading upward toward the tower, and the foundation walls. "The shelter is real," she said. "The ventilation route is real. The tower's lean is old but measurable. The west foundation needs drainage work. Also, your temporary bracing is ugly. Is it unsafe? No? Then ugly is within budget. This time Nora actually laughed. It was brief, dry, and gone quickly, but Bear lifted his head as if noting a structural improvement. The world outside St. Aldrich, however, did not warm with them. Meridian returned on a Thursday afternoon beneath a sky the color of dull pewter. Ethan saw the dark SUV first, then a white pickup with contractor markings. Bear came to stand beside him at the side door, body alert but quiet. Lydia Marr stepped out in a black wool coat, her bobbed hair tucked neatly behind one ear. She looked as polished as before, but the field wind worried the edges of her scarf. Beside her came a younger man with sandy hair, a soft-shell jacket bearing a contractor logo, and a tablet tucked under one arm. He was in his 30s, narrow-shouldered, tired around the eyes. His hard hat hung from 2 fingers, as if even it weighed more than it should. "Mr. Cole," Lydia called, professional warmth already in place. "I hope we're not intruding." "You are," Ethan said. Her smile did not move. "Then I'll be brief." The young man looked at the church rather than at Ethan. His eyes moved from the roofline to the tower, to the west foundation, to the broken windows. Not a tourist's look, an engineer's. "This is Caleb Sutter," Lydia said. "He works with one of our structural review partners." Caleb nodded. "Mr. Cole." Bear sniffed the air and gave Caleb a long, measuring stare. Caleb, to his credit, did not try to charm the dog. He simply stood still and let himself be judged. Lydia opened her folder. "Meridian remains concerned about the safety of this property. The belfry in particular may pose a hazard if left unsecured." "Funny," Ethan said. "Last week you wanted to buy it. Now you want to protect me from it." "Those positions are not mutually exclusive." "No, I imagine they travel together often." Caleb glanced down, almost smiling, then buried it quickly. Lydia continued. "The proposed interchange could bring significant economic relief to Millbrook. Access roads, construction jobs, commercial investment. You've seen the storefronts. This town needs movement." Ethan looked past her toward the fields. She was not wrong. That bothered him more than if she had lied. Millbrook was tired. He had seen it in the closed theater, the thin shelves at the hardware store, the diner waitress counting tips twice before sliding them into her apron. A highway interchange was not a villain in itself. Roads could save towns as surely as they could divide them. But roads could also pave over memory and call the smoothness progress. Caleb shifted his weight. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "if the county orders a new safety review and the tower is declared unstable, you could be required to secure or vacate parts of the structure." "Secure," Ethan repeated. "Meaning seal." Caleb's eyes flickered toward Lydia. "Not necessarily," he said. Lydia's voice remained smooth. "No one wants difficulty here." Bear gave a low breath through his nose. Ethan felt the old anger rise, but this time it did not own the room. Behind him were files. Beside him was Bear. Somewhere in town, Mabel was probably committing a minor archival sin. Nora Whitcomb was at her table, making numbers behave. He looked at Caleb. "Do you believe the tower is in immediate danger?" Caleb hesitated. Lydia turned slightly. "Caleb," the young engineer's face tightened. "Bills, contracts, duty, fear?" Ethan could see them passing behind his eyes like trucks crossing a narrow bridge. "I'd need a full review," Caleb said at last. "But from here, immediate danger would be difficult to state." The answer was small. It was also costly. Lydia closed her folder. "We'll be in touch." "I'm sure you will." She walked back toward the SUV. Caleb lingered half a second longer. His gaze moved to Bear, then to Ethan. "Document everything," he said quietly. Then he followed Lydia. The vehicles rolled away, leaving two dark lines in the snow. Ethan stood in the doorway of St. Aldrich while the wind crossed the wheat fields. For the first time he understood that the fight before him was not clean enough to be called good against evil. Millbrook wanted the interchange because hungry towns did not have the luxury of worshiping old buildings. Meridian promised work, traffic, revival. Lydia spoke the language of future meals and repaired storefronts. And Ethan, a man whose own record had been used against him, was asking people to pause at the threshold of tomorrow and climb down into a cold room beneath yesterday. Bear leaned against his leg. The pressure was familiar, steady. Ethan rested one hand on the dog's head and looked up at the leaning bell tower. Memory, he thought, was not gentle. It did not arrive carrying flowers. It came with boxes of paper, bad math, old grief, and names nobody wanted to say aloud. But in the snowbound silence of St. Aldrich, Ethan began to understand something Reverend Elias Rook must have known. A town that forgot too easily could be bought cheaply, and a man who remembered alone could be dismissed. So Ethan would not remember alone. Colonel Thaddeus Reeve arrived in Millbrook on an afternoon so bright with snow that even the shadows seemed polished. Ethan saw the black sedan first from the west window of St. Aldrich. It came along the county road slowly, not because the driver feared the ice, but because some men believed arrival was a ceremony. The car stopped near the church steps. A moment later, Reeve stepped out into the white glare, as if the weather had been arranged for him. He wore a charcoal overcoat that looked too expensive for the county road beneath his shoes. His boots were dark, clean, and shined to a hard gleam. Silver hair cut close. Straight back, shoulders square. Even without a uniform, he carried command the way a blade carried an edge. Bear was beside Ethan before the second car door closed. The German shepherd did not growl. He simply stood with his torn right ear lifted, body angled toward the entrance, eyes fixed on the man outside. Ethan felt his throat tighten. For years he had imagined what he might say if he ever stood in front of Thaddeus Reeve again. In those imagined scenes, Ethan was calm, sharp, unshakable. He said the perfect thing, the kind of sentence that broke open a lie and left the liar speechless. Real life was less generous. When Reeve entered St. Aldrich, Ethan's first thought was not noble or clever. It was only this: the man looks exactly the same. Older, yes, a little more silver at the temples, a few more lines around the mouth. But the center of him remained unchanged, smooth, certain, untouched by the wreckage his words had left behind. "Cole," Reeve said. Not Ethan, not Mr. Cole, just the surname, clipped and familiar, as if calling roll in a place where Ethan still answered to him. "Colonel," Ethan said, "I retired from active service." "Habit?" Reeve's eyes moved over the sanctuary, the cracked altar, the braced side aisle, the hymnals stacked over file folders, the colored winter light lying broken across the floor. His expression did not change, but Ethan saw the assessment behind it. Weakness, disorder, vulnerability. Bear stepped forward, placing himself halfway between the two men. Reeve looked down. "That the dog from your unit?" "Yes." "Still with you, loyal animal." Ethan's hand twitched. There were men who could turn any good word into an insult. Reeve had that gift. Loyal animal sounded too close to obedient tool. "He has standards," Ethan said. Reeve's gaze returned to him. "Then perhaps he can advise you." A soft wind pressed through the broken glass. Somewhere high in the tower, old timber made a sound like a knuckle cracking. Reeve removed his gloves slowly, finger by finger. On his right hand, Ethan noticed the ring, a silver signet with an engraved R. Harlan Reeve's letter, perhaps. Family pride made small enough to wear on a finger and heavy enough to bend history around it. "I was told Meridian made you a generous offer," Reeve said. "They did." "And you refused?" "I did." "May I ask why?" "No." For the first time, something faint moved in Reeves' face. Not anger. Amusement, maybe? The kind a man shows when a subordinate forgets where he stands. "I understand resentment, Cole. I truly do. A man loses his position, his home, his marriage, and he looks for a shape to blame. It is human." The words entered Ethan like cold water poured through the ribs. Bear shifted his weight. Reeve walked down the aisle at an easy pace, hands behind his back. He might have been touring a battlefield after the smoke cleared, noting what could still be useful. "This place," Reeve continued, "will not heal you. Ruins don't make men whole. They only give them somewhere to hide." Ethan said nothing. "You have an opportunity to leave with dignity. Sell the property, take the money, move somewhere with heat and a roof that does not argue with gravity. Start again while starting again is still available to you." "A kind exit," Ethan said. "Yes?" Reeves stopped beneath a broken panel of blue glass. "A kind exit." The phrase was polished, benevolent, almost merciful, and under it lay the old knife. Ethan remembered the hearing room, Reeves' voice saying failure to maintain standards. Reeves' eyes never once meeting his when the final recommendation was read. The calm way a man could step aside and let another man's life take the full weight of a falling bridge. "You always were good at exits," Ethan said quietly. "Especially other people's." Reeves' expression hardened by a degree. "Careful." The word was mild. It did more damage than a shout. Something dark rose in Ethan then, slow and heavy, like floodwater behind a cracked dam. His hands curled. His body leaned forward before his mind had chosen to move. Years of swallowed words gathered in his chest, words with rusted edges. Bear stepped fully between them. No bark, no teeth. Just his broad black and gold body, planted firm on the old floorboards, torn ear pointed toward Reeve, amber eyes steady. The dog's silence filled the sanctuary with a discipline Ethan had forgotten he still trusted. Bear had known buried charges, bad wiring, disturbed earth, men whose fear made them dangerous. He had learned that not every threat ticked. Some wore polished boots, some spoke softly. Some placed a sentence exactly where a man was already injured and waited for him to detonate himself. Ethan looked at the dog. Then he breathed. Once, twice. The floodwater did not vanish. It lowered enough for him to stand. Reeve watched the exchange with narrow interest. "Still taking commands from him?" "No," Ethan said. "Still learning from him." A silence passed. Then Reeve put his gloves back on. "You are out of your depth, Cole." "That happened years ago." "Yes," Reeve said, "and yet you insist on swimming toward deeper water." He turned toward the door, then paused without looking back. "Men like you often mistake suffering for purpose. Don't. Meridian will have that corridor one way or another. Do not turn a fair offer into an unnecessary consequence." He left St. Aldrich as neatly as he had entered. Outside, the black sedan rolled away through snow, so bright it hurt the eyes. Ethan stood in the aisle for a long time after the engine faded. His whole body shook, not visibly perhaps, but inside, where the old fractures lived. Bear leaned against his knee. The pressure was firm enough to anchor him. "You know," Ethan said hoarsely, "if you ever want to bite somebody, we should discuss a legal strategy first." Bear huffed. "Right, no promises." By late afternoon, Nora Whitcomb arrived with her black notebook, yellow laser measure, and a face that suggested the world had already wasted enough of her day. Mabel came with her, carrying a thermos, a stack of photocopies, and a paper bag she claimed contained emotional support biscuits, though Bear clearly considered them operational supplies. Ethan told them about Reeve. Nora listened without interrupting. That alone made the story feel serious. When he finished, she looked toward the tower. "Then we stopped treating the belfry claws like folklore." Mabel set her bag on a pew. "I've been saying that since Tuesday." "You've been saying many things since Tuesday," Nora replied. Some of them were even useful. They began in the rear of the sanctuary, at the base of the spiral stair. Nora measured the position of the hatch, the stairwell, the tower walls, and the direction of the ventilation pipe in the shelter below. Ethan showed her Elias Rook's old sketches, the ones that marked the tower not simply as a bell structure, but as a reference point for wind, vibration, and ground movement. Nora's dry impatience gave way to concentration. "This tower was used as a survey marker," she said, tapping the drawing. "Not officially pretty, but practical. High point, fixed line of sight, stable enough when the notes were made." "Stable enough then," Ethan said. "Stable enough to matter now." She flipped another page. "The ventilation shaft runs from the shelter up through the tower chase. If someone seals the belfry, they alter the airflow and access route. If they damage the foundation, they compromise a documented structure tied to federal survey records." Mabel looked pleased. "So Elias wrote the clause because of the shelter." "Partly," Nora said. "Maybe to keep the shelter from becoming a sealed tomb. Maybe to preserve evidence. Maybe because he was a stubborn old man who liked making future bureaucrats miserable." "All can be true," Ethan said. Nora gave him a brief, approving glance. "You're learning." They worked until daylight faded. The more they compared the old notes with the actual structure, the more the church's oddities began to align. The tower was not merely symbolic, it was a throat. The shelter below was the lung. The old church breathed through the very thing Meridian wanted sealed. That understanding changed Ethan's fear. Before, he had feared the files could be dismissed. Now he understood the building itself was evidence. At dusk, while Nora packed her tools, Caleb Sutter appeared at the side door without Lydia. He looked as if he had not slept. His sandy hair was flattened under a knit cap, and his contractor jacket was zipped to his chin. In one hand he held a folded set of prints. In the other, his hard hat, though he had not bothered to put it on. Bear rose. Caleb stopped immediately. "I'm not here for trouble." "Trouble usually says that," Ethan said. Caleb swallowed. "I know." Nora stepped beside Ethan. "Mr. Sutter, does your employer know you're here?" "No." "That is the first intelligent thing you've said." He glanced at her, then at Ethan. "Meridian doesn't know what's under this church." "Not specifically." Mabel's eyes sharpened. "But they know enough." Caleb nodded. "They know St. Aldrich is a records risk. That's the phrase. Records risk. There are old references in corridor planning notes, property complications, archived survey markers, trust restrictions. For years, they tried to buy or neutralize the parcel." Quietly. "Neutralize?" Ethan repeated. Caleb looked ashamed of the word. "Legal review, safety orders, access restrictions, maintenance pressure, things that make a property too expensive to keep." The church creaked above them, as if offended by the vocabulary. "When you won the auction," Caleb said, "people panicked, not because they knew you found anything, because you weren't supposed to be there. You were an unknown owner with technical knowledge and nothing obvious to lose." Ethan almost laughed at that. Nothing obvious to lose. Men in warm offices loved that phrase. It overlooked the last blanket, the old dog, the name on a tag, the one fragile thread by which a person still held himself to earth. Caleb held out the folded prints. "These are not enough. Not proof, just corridor overlays. But compare them to Rook's tower markers. The interchange work zone goes right through the old foundation perimeter." Nora took the papers. "Why give us this?" Ethan asked. Caleb looked toward the sanctuary, then at Bear. The dog's gaze remained steady, not hostile, simply unwilling to make moral decisions easy for anyone. "Because I told myself it was just development," Caleb said. "I told myself old buildings come down, towns need roads, and paperwork always looks ugly if you dig long enough. Then I saw the shelter access marked as non-essential void space on an internal review. Mabel's voice cooled. Void space? Meaning they knew there was something under it? They knew there was a space. They didn't want to know more. Nora unfolded the prints on a pew. That is a very expensive kind of ignorance. Caleb lowered his voice. There may be an emergency inspection order coming. Soon, they'll claim the tower became unsafe after the weather. They'll push to restrict access. To seal it, Ethan said. Caleb did not answer. He did not need to. After Caleb left, the church felt colder. Not because of the weather, but because the shape of the next move had entered the room. Meridian would not kick down a door. It would arrive with forms, vests, barriers, clipboards, and language so tidy it could step over a man and call him an obstruction. Night came hard. Mabel wanted Ethan to leave the files at Nora's house. Nora agreed. Ethan agreed in principle, then refused in practice. There were still folders in the shelter he had not sorted, including the newer procurement copies that tied Meridian-affiliated suppliers to military projects. "I'll bring the last box tonight," he said. Nora did not like it. "You're exhausted." "I'm also already here." "Those are not opposing facts." Mabel folded her arms. "That is librarian for you're being stubborn." "I know." Bear watched him from near the hatch. Ethan looked at the dog. "Don't start." Bear blinked. "I said, don't." By 10, the church was quiet again. Nora and Mabel had gone, taking 2 boxes of files and leaving Ethan with instructions, extra batteries, and more concern than he knew how to carry. Outside, snow had begun again in small, hard grains that tapped against the broken glass. Ethan went down into the shelter with a lantern, a file crate, and Bear waiting above. The old generator ran for 20 minutes before coughing. Ethan sorted quickly, hands steady now, stacking procurement summaries, supplier charts, and Rook's later notes into the crate. The shelter was colder than before. His breath fogged the air. Above him, the church boards creaked in the wind. Then came another sound. Engines, more than one. Ethan went still. Boots moved overhead, voices muffled by the floor, a metallic clank outside, near the entrance. Bear barked once, sharp and angry. Ethan climbed the stairs and pushed at the hatch. It did not move. He pushed harder. Something heavy had been placed across it. "Hey!" he shouted. "I'm down here!" The voices above paused. Then one of them said faintly, "Areas secured." Another voice replied, "Market restricted until review." Ethan slammed his palm against the underside of the hatch. "I said I'm down here!" No answer. A moment later, the light strung above the stair flickered and died. The generator below gave 2 weak coughs, then fell silent. Darkness pressed in. For several seconds, Ethan heard only his own breathing. Then Bear began to move overhead, not barking wildly, not wasting himself. Ethan could hear the scrape of claws crossing the old floor, stopping, circling, then moving again. The dog was searching, thinking in scent and air, not panic. "Bear!" Ethan called. A muffled whine came from above, then faded toward the rear of the church. The air in the shelter seemed to shrink. Ethan felt along the wall until his hand found the ventilation pipe. Cold air moved through it faintly, brushing his fingers like the breath of something buried but alive. Above, Bear had found the same breath. The German shepherd ran low through the sanctuary, nose skimming the boards. He passed the pews, the altar, the organ that gave a weak moan as wind moved through it, and reached the spiral stair to the bell tower. Dust rose beneath his paws. His hips protested the climb, but he climbed anyway. Once, near the middle turn, he slipped. His chest hit the step, his claws scraped iron. For a heartbeat, he stayed there, breathing hard. Then he rose. Old soldiers did not need applause. They needed work worth the pain. At the top, the belfry was silver with moonlight and blowing snow. The old bell hung in shadow, large and greened with age. A rope dropped from the mechanism, stiff and half caught against a rotten wooden stop. Near the wall, the ventilation shaft breathed cold air into the tower chase. Bear went to the moving air. He clawed at the old wood around it. Once, twice, again. The rotten stop shifted. The rope jerked. Bear drove his shoulder into it, not understanding bell mechanisms, not understanding federal clauses, not understanding Meridian or Reeve or 30 years of hidden reports. He understood only this. Ethan was below. The air moved here, and the thing in front of him had to give. The stop snapped loose. The rope pulled. The bell moved for the first time in years. The first sound that came from it was terrible. Bent, cracked, and offended, like a goose discovering angels had poor manners. It rolled out across the sanctuary, over the men outside, over the parked vehicles, over the snowbound wheat. Bear barked once, then slammed against the rope again. The second toll came deeper. The third found the old bronze heart of the bell. It thundered over Millbrook, across the white fields and sleeping roads, into kitchens, bedrooms, barns, and the yellow-lit library where Mabel Wren looked up from a stack of copies and whispered a word no librarian should use near public records. In the shelter below, Ethan heard the bell through concrete, wood, and cold earth. He closed one hand around the file crate. "Good boy," he whispered. Above him, St. Aldrich kept ringing. The bell did not sound like a miracle. It sounded like metal remembering pain. The first toll staggered over Millbrook, bent and hoarse, as if St. Aldrich had woken from a 30-year sleep and found its throat full of dust. The second toll was stronger. By the third, lights began appearing across the town and along the county roads, one window at a time, each square of yellow cutting into the winter dark. Mabel Wren heard it from the library. She had been standing over a microfilm reader, muttering at a blurry newspaper scan from 1987, when the bell rolled through the building and made the old windows tremble. For one breath, she went perfectly still. Then she said a word no librarian should ever say near public records. 5 minutes later, her station wagon was fishtailing gently along the snowy road toward St. Aldrich. A thermos rolled around on the passenger floor. Her purple knit hat sat crooked over her white curls. She kept one hand on the wheel and the other on the horn, not because it helped, but because worry needed somewhere to go. "You old iron-mouthed fool," she snapped toward the bell tower as it loomed ahead. "You wait 30 years to speak, and now you choose the hour when every road in the county is slick as buttered glass." Behind her came Nora Whitcomb's pickup, its headlights clean and hard through the snow. Nora arrived with a flashlight, bolt cutters, a pry bar, and the expression of a woman who had spent much of her life waiting for an official safety procedure to reveal its teeth. Caleb Sutter reached them moments later in his contractor truck. He stumbled out without his hard hat, coat half-zipped, face pale beneath the yard light that Mabel had somehow found and switched on. His eyes went first to the temporary barriers near the church entrance, then to the darkened windows, then up to the tower where the bell still swayed faintly. "Oh no," he whispered. Nora heard him. That is rarely a helpful engineering statement. They weren't supposed to come tonight. Caleb looked toward the side door. Not with him inside. Mabel's face lost its color. Inside? Where? Caleb did not answer fast enough. Nora was already moving. The side entrance had been marked with bright caution tape and a temporary notice clipped to a folding stand. Restricted Structural Review Area. Access prohibited pending assessment. Nora read it once, then she tore it off and handed it to Mabel. "Archive that," she said. Mabel folded it with icy precision. With pleasure? Inside, St. Aldrich was cold, dark, and full of the fading vibration of the bell. Bear's bark came from above, high in the tower, sharp with urgency. A moment later, claws scraped down the spiral stairs. The German shepherd appeared in the sanctuary, dust-covered, breathing hard, torn-ear crooked eyes wild with purpose. "Bear!" Mabel cried. He did not stop for her. He ran straight to the hatch at the base of the tower stairs and pawed at it, then turned to Nora as if he had filed his report and expected immediate action. The hatch was blocked from above by a heavy temporary brace wedged across the floorboards. Not locked exactly. Worse, placed in a way that could be explained later as precaution. Nora knelt, touched the brace, then looked at Caleb. "Who placed this?" "I don't know names," he said quickly. "Emergency review crew, Meridian safety contractor. I saw the notice come through, but I thought it was scheduled for morning." Mabel's voice shook. "Ethan is under there?" From below came a muffled strike. Then Ethan's voice, strained but clear enough. "Bear?" The dog whined and dug at the floor. Nora's face hardened into something almost holy in its anger. Not loud, not wild, just exact. "Move!" They worked together without ceremony. Nora directed. Caleb lifted one end of the brace. Ethan struck from below when he heard the shift. Mabel held the flashlight steady with both hands, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Bear circled once, then forced himself to sit, trembling with the effort of obedience. The brace came loose. Nora and Caleb lifted the hatch. Cold air breathed up from the shelter. Ethan stood 3 steps below, one hand gripping the rail, the other clamped around an oilcloth-wrapped file bundle. His face was pale. Dust streaked his red and black plaid jacket. His hair was damp at the temples from cold sweat, and for a second he looked older than 46, as if the earth below the church had tried to keep a few years of him. Bear launched himself down the stairs. "Easy," Ethan rasped. Bear ignored him completely, which was his right as rescuer. He shoved his silvered muzzle into Ethan's chest, sneezed from the dust, licked Ethan's chin, then sneezed again with such offended violence that Mabel made a broken sound between a laugh and a sob. Ethan sank onto the step and wrapped one arm around Bear's neck. He did not say, "Thank you." The words would have been too small. They would have fallen like pebbles into a well. Instead, he pressed his forehead briefly against the dog's torn ear, while Bear leaned into him with all the weight of a promise kept. When they brought Ethan up into the sanctuary, Mabel wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and thrust a cup of hot coffee into his hands. He nearly dropped it. Nora took it back, frowned at his shaking fingers, and made him sit in the front pew. "I'm fine," he said. "You are cold, exhausted, and stupid," Nora replied. "Fine is not on the list." Caleb stood near the hatch, staring at the removed brace as if it were a confession laid on the floor. "They'll say it was procedure," he said. Nora turned on him. "Then we will discuss procedure." Her voice sharpened, and each word became a nail driven into wood. No confirmation that the owner had vacated the structure, no posted prior notice, no county coordination, power cut during a restricted action, hatch access obstructed without internal clearance, interference with a documented subsurface structure tied to federal survey records. And all of it at night during weather after direct discussions about the Belfry Clause. Mabel lifted the torn notice. Also, their sign was ugly. Nora looked at her. "What? It matters symbolically." Ethan gave a weak laugh, and the sound seemed to reassure Bear more than the blanket did. The dog lay at Ethan's boots, but kept his eyes on the door. Caleb rubbed both hands over his face. "I'll testify." No one spoke for a moment. The sentence changed the air. Mabel lowered the notice. Nora's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion this time, but in assessment. Ethan looked up slowly. Caleb swallowed. "I'll testify that Meridian knew St. Aldrich was a records risk, that they wanted the parcel controlled before the interchange approval moved forward. That internal review marked the shelter area as void space even after concerns were raised. I can't prove everything, but I can say what I saw." Nora nodded once. Then stop talking and write it down before courage cools. By dawn, St. Aldrich had become less a church than a field office for the stubborn. Nora sat up at the altar with drawings, a ruler, her black notebook, and a fury so organized it could have applied for a grant. Mabel drove back to town and returned with copied newspaper articles, county maps, archived land records, and a box of donuts she declared necessary for justice. Caleb brought corridor overlays and internal review notes he had already printed before fear could talk him out of it. Ethan worked slowly at first, still cold from the shelter, but once his hands steadied, the old discipline returned. He drew the church from above: sanctuary, tower, hatch, stairwell, shelter, ventilation route. He marked the belfry line of sight from Elias Rook's survey notes. He overlaid the proposed interchange footprint. He labeled the old foundation perimeter and the point where Meridian's work zone crossed the documented structure. He did not write like a man pleading to be believed. He wrote like a man building a bridge across disbelief. Each connection became a plank. The old Midwest bridge failures, Ardham's civil supply, Meridian's corporate lineage, Harlan Reeves' signatures, revised material certifications, the defense-adjacent suppliers, the temporary span overseas. Thaddeus Reeves' role in the final report, no single page could carry the whole truth. But together, the pages began to hold. By mid-morning, people started arriving, not many at first: a truck with a cracked windshield, an old sedan with mismatched doors, a farm pickup with hay dust still in the bed. They had heard the bell. They had heard through the swift underground river of small towns that Ethan Cole had been trapped beneath St. Aldrich during a Meridian safety action. Howard Bell came leaning on a cane, his shoulders still broad beneath a brown coat. He had once driven a loaded truck over a bridge that settled under him like a tired animal kneeling. He did not dramatize the memory. He only handed Mabel a folded packet of letters and said, "They told me not to make trouble." Dale Pritchard arrived next, a farmer with wind-reddened skin and hands like fence posts. He had lost a grain shed after a road approach failed during a thaw. The settlement had paid for lumber, not for the years of debt that followed. He stood in the aisle, looking at the cracked altar, and said, "My wife told me to burn those papers. I didn't know why until this morning." Others came with smaller things: old photographs, repair invoices, copies of agreements written in language meant to exhaust ordinary people before it informed them. None of them brought certainty. They brought fragments. But memory, Ethan was learning, did not return as a clean statue. It came back as shards in weathered hands. When Nora called the federal contact she had once worked with on an infrastructure review, Ethan stepped outside. He stood on the stone steps in the cold daylight, wrapped in Mabel's blanket, Bear at his side. Snow had stopped falling. The road showed tire marks from all the people who had come because an old bell refused to be polite. Ethan should have felt stronger. Instead, fear moved through him with the quiet persistence of winter wind. He had trusted procedure once. He had believed that if the facts were placed in the correct order before the correct people, truth would rise by its own clean power. Then a colonel with a smooth voice had placed Ethan's name where other names should have been, and the machinery had accepted it. Now he was preparing to step back into machinery. Bear pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg. From inside, Nora's voice carried faintly through the open door. Precise, unsentimental. Mabel's followed, brighter and sharper. Caleb's, nervous but present. Then Howard Bell's low rumble. Dale Pritchard's careful words. Ethan closed his hand around the dog tags beneath his shirt. This time he would not enter alone. The federal inspectors arrived 2 days later. They came in dark coats and practical boots, not like avenging angels, which disappointed Mabel, who said at least one trumpet would have improved morale. There were 3 of them, a senior investigator named Martin Hale, a woman from Federal Infrastructure Oversight, and a records specialist who looked at Mabel's filing system and visibly reconsidered his own career. The first meeting was not dramatic. It was worse. It was procedural. Questions: timelines, chain of custody, document origin, site access, safety actions, names, dates, copies, cross-references. Ethan answered what he knew and refused the temptation to fill gaps with guesses. Nora corrected wording when necessary. Mabel produced source material like a magician with reading glasses. Caleb, pale but steady, gave a signed statement. Then Reeve answered. Not in person at first. Through a letter, then through counsel, then through a recorded statement that circulated among the investigators. He called Ethan's credibility into question with the same old tools polished for a new table. Former serviceman with adverse record. Personal grievance. Unstable living situation. Financial stress. Motive to retaliate against a former superior. Ethan read the summary in silence. For a moment, the church tilted backward in time. Then Howard Bell, who had been sitting in the rear pew, pushed himself to his feet. "Well," he said, voice rough, "if that's how they write about him, I wonder what they wrote about the rest of us." No one laughed. The sentence landed harder than anger. Mabel looked down at the files in her lap. Nora's jaw tightened. Caleb stared at the floor. Dale Pritchard removed his cap and held it in both hands. Something shifted then, not legally perhaps, not yet, but morally. Reeve had tried to isolate Ethan by making him the unreliable man at the center of the story. Instead, he reminded everyone in that room how easily a system could turn a life into a footnote and then blame the footnote for being small. Later that afternoon, a young reporter from the Millbrook Ledger arrived. Her name was June Attell, and she looked barely old enough to have lost faith in journalism, though her eyes suggested she was working on it. She had a camera, a notebook, and the cautious excitement of someone who had come expecting a local oddity and found the edge of something larger. She asked to photograph the site. Ethan said no to anything that showed sensitive documents clearly. Nora approved that answer. Mabel approved Nora approving it. But while they argued over angles, Bear wandered to the main evidence box and lay down in front of it, forepaws crossed, torn ear lifted, eyes solemn enough to shame a marble statue. June raised her camera. "Can I take that?" Ethan looked at Bear. Bear looked back, magnificent and dusty, and entirely unaware that he had biscuit crumbs on one whisker. "Fine," Ethan said. "But don't let him negotiate image rights." The photograph ran online that evening beneath the headline, "The Dog Guarding the Truth at St. Aldrich." By nightfall, it had traveled beyond Millbrook. By morning, calls began coming into the county office, then the regional papers, then offices that had ignored far more formal messages in the past. The image was imperfect, almost ridiculous in its sincerity. An aging German shepherd lying before a battered evidence box in a broken church, as if truth itself needed a loyal animal to keep warm. Ethan found Bear later behind Mabel's tote bag, eating half a packet of biscuits he had absolutely not been authorized to inspect. "You're famous for integrity," Ethan told him. Bear chewed. "This is disappointing." Bear swallowed and looked noble. "Your lucky symbols don't have to be perfect." That afternoon, the federal team issued a temporary protective order over St. Aldrich and the surrounding structural records. The proposed interchange project was paused pending review. Meridian released a statement about cooperation, transparency, and commitment to community safety. Mabel read it aloud in the sanctuary and said it sounded like a casserole made entirely of fog. Reeve was formally requested to provide documents and appear for questioning. The news did not make Ethan feel victorious. He stood near the front of the church as officials placed protective seals on the file cabinets, the hatch, and the shelter entrance. This time, St. Aldrich was being sealed to preserve what it held, not to bury it. The distinction mattered. Still, the sight of tape and signatures made his stomach tighten. Justice, he realized, did not arrive like trumpets. It came with forms, damp boots, tired eyes, contested timelines, and people arguing over whether a copy counted if the original was missing. It came like snowmelt, cold, slow, messy, leaving mud before it showed the ground. As evening fell, the town lights flickered on beyond the fields. St. Aldrich stood under the pale sky, no longer abandoned, no longer silent, but not yet saved either. Ethan sat on the front step with Bear beside him. The dog rested his head on Ethan's knee, exhausted from heroism, publicity, and unauthorized biscuits. "You woke the town," Ethan said. Bear sighed. "Don't let it go to your head." The bell above them hung still now, dark against the tower. But Millbrook had heard, and once a town had heard its own buried memory ringing across the snow, it could not pretend the silence had been peace. Months passed, and Millbrook learned that justice did not travel fast. It moved like thaw water under snow. Quiet first, invisible, then suddenly everywhere, loosening the hard ground, darkening the roads, dripping from eaves, finding every crack that winter had sealed. By late March, the wheat fields around St. Aldrich no longer looked dead beneath the white. The snow had thinned into silver patches between rows of stubborn green shoots, and the earth beneath them seemed to be writing its testimony upward, blade by blade. St. Aldrich still looked old. No kindness could make it otherwise. The church still creaked when the wind came from the west. The north wall still complained on cold mornings. The organ still groaned occasionally when air slipped through its pipes, producing a sound Mabel Wren described as a mule attempting prayer. Bear remained deeply opposed to the instrument and treated every moan as a personal insult. But the roof had been patched. Temporary braces had become proper supports. The broken windows were sealed with clear panels until restoration funds could be found. The bell tower no longer leaned like a tired drunk against the sky. It had been stabilized with steel, care, and Nora Whitcomb's severe disapproval of every shortcut offered by cheaper contractors. The shelter beneath the floor had been catalogued, photographed, measured, and protected. Its files were no longer ghosts wrapped in oilcloth. They had case numbers now, copies, logs, chain of custody forms, labels neat enough to make even Mabel nod without immediately reorganizing them. The front door, once swollen shut with weather and neglect, opened each morning. That changed everything. For years, St. Aldrich had stood in the field like a sealed mouth. Now people came and went through it with folders under their arms, thermoses in their hands, questions in their faces. Some came to help. Some came to look. Some came because the bell had rung across a part of themselves they thought had gone quiet forever. The federal investigation widened slowly, then steadily. Meridian's polished public statements began to lose their shine under subpoenas, document requests, old contract reviews, supplier audits, and the patient cruelty of numbers that refused to stay buried. Artem Civil Supply, the old predecessor company Elias Rook had circled again and again in blue pencil, became more than a name in a dead man's files. Its records led outward like winter roots, into regional bridge contracts, maintenance reviews, settlement agreements, subcontractor networks, and eventually into modern procurement chains that had once brushed against military projects overseas. Thaddeus Reeve did not fall in a thunderclap. Ethan had once imagined that men like Reeve would be undone dramatically, exposed beneath a bright light, their smooth voices finally cracking before a room full of witnesses. Real life was less theatrical and more satisfying in a colder way. Reeve was pulled inch by inch into the plain daylight of documents. A signature here, an email there, a recommendation that did not match the field warning attached to it, a procurement review routed away from standard channels, a relationship disclosed too late, a family name appearing where it should have raised questions rather than opened doors. He answered through attorneys at first, then in statements, then before investigators. Each time his language remained careful. Each time it carried less command. Ethan watched from a distance. He did not attend every hearing. He did not haunt every courthouse hallway. He had spent too many years letting Reeve live inside his skull without paying rent. Instead, Ethan worked on St. Aldrich. He replaced rotten boards. He sanded splintered pews. He hauled old debris out of the side room. He oiled the hinges. He measured, cut, braced, built. Repair became a kind of prayer for a man who no longer knew what he believed. One gray morning, a thick envelope arrived from a review board connected to his old service record. Ethan held it for nearly an hour before opening it. Bear watched from beneath the table, head on his paws, eyes half closed, but not asleep. "You could open it," Ethan said. Bear lifted one eyebrow patch. "Right, lack of thumbs. Convenient." Inside was not a miracle. There was no grand apology written in gold, no declaration that every lost year would be returned, no sentence powerful enough to rebuild a home that had already been sold or restore every friendship that had quietly retreated. The letter stated that his case had been reopened for review in light of newly obtained material evidence. That was all. And yet Ethan sat very still with the paper in his hands. For years, the accusation against him had been a stone sealed into the foundation of his life. Now, for the first time, a crack ran through it. Not freedom, not yet, but air. Bear rose, came to him, and placed his muzzle on Ethan's knee. Ethan laid one hand between the dog's torn ears. "I know," he whispered. "Don't make a speech." Bear sighed, which was good, because Ethan was not sure he could survive mercy if it came with language attached. The larger offer came 2 weeks later. It arrived through attorneys wrapped in phrases as smooth as river stones: settlement, non-disparagement, transfer of ownership, mutual release, confidentiality, relocation support. Meridian proposed enough money to change Ethan's life quickly. Not extravagantly, perhaps, not movie-rich, but enough to buy a real house, a reliable truck, veterinary care for Bear for the rest of his days, and silence padded thick enough to sleep on. Ethan read the amount twice, then a third time. He was not a saint, and poverty had not made him noble. Poverty had made him tired. It had taught him the exact price of gasoline, canned soup, boot soles, replacement belts, antibiotics, dog food, and one warm room with a working lock. Men who had never slept in a van loved to speak lightly of refusing money. Ethan did not. Money had weight, he felt it in his hands. For one long afternoon he sat alone in the sanctuary with the settlement letter laid across the cracked altar. Sunlight came through the repaired windows in colorless sheets. Outside, meltwater dripped from the eaves. Bear lay in the aisle, watching the door. The old church waited without opinion. Ethan imagined leaving. He imagined handing over the keys, taking the check, driving out past the wheat fields while contractors fenced the property and men, in clean jackets, decided what could be removed, sealed, renamed, or explained away. He imagined a small house somewhere else, a yard for Bear, heat in every room, no reporters, no case numbers, no waking each day as the hinge between buried truth and public inconvenience. Then he imagined St. Aldrich, silent again, not peaceful, silenced. He folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. When Nora arrived, she found him still at the altar. "Well?" she asked. "I'm taking enough to repair the building and pay the debts tied to it," Ethan said. "Through counsel, open record, no confidentiality on public safety matters." "And the property transfer?" "No." Nora's expression did not soften, but something in her shoulders eased. "Good," she said. "I hate moving heavy files twice." Mabel declared the decision reasonably sane, which is all one can ask of men before lunch. Caleb said nothing for a while, then offered to rebuild the rear office shelves without charging for labor. He had left Meridian 3 days earlier, not heroically, not with a speech. He simply cleared his desk, surrendered his badge, and walked out carrying a cardboard box of notebooks, shame, and one cracked tablet. Lydia Marr's turn came more quietly. She did not visit St. Aldrich in person at first. Through her attorney, she provided internal emails that confirmed Meridian knew the church parcel carried unresolved historical record concerns and had discussed strategies to limit access before the interchange approval. Her name appeared in some chains, not as villain, not as savior, but as someone who had stood too long in rooms where truth was translated into risk management. Months later, Ethan saw her once from a distance across the county courthouse steps. She wore a dark coat instead of the camel one, no polished smile, no silver pen in hand. She looked smaller without the machinery of Meridian around her, which made her more human, and in some ways, sadder. She did not approach him. She only nodded once. Ethan nodded back. Some forms of apology did not deserve applause. Some were not even complete. They were simply the first step out of a room that should never have been entered. By early April, St. Aldrich had a new sign. Mabel insisted on wood, not plastic. Nora insisted it be level. Caleb built the frame 3 times before Nora stopped narrowing her eyes at it. The sign hung near the front steps, simple and dark against the pale stone. St. Aldrich Veterans, Record Clinic Ring if you need witness. There was no grand opening with balloons. Ethan threatened to leave town if anyone brought balloons. Mabel accused him of emotional cowardice and brought cinnamon bread instead, which everyone agreed was less visually offensive. The first visitors came before the paint had fully dried, men and women in their 60s, 70s, even older. Veterans with folders tied in string, former workers with settlement papers, widows and widowers carrying letters in plastic sleeves, retired mechanics, nurses, drivers, engineers, people whose lives had been summarized by departments, corrected by strangers, or misplaced in systems too large to feel shame. They did not always speak at first. Some sat in the front pew and stared at the cracked altar. Some stood near the evidence display, reading Elias Rook's copied notes with their mouths pressed tight. Some placed their papers on Mabel's desk and said, "I don't know if this matters." Mabel always answered the same way. "Then we shall find out properly." Nora handled technical review in the old side office, which now contained drafting lamps, shelves, labeled boxes, and a coffee maker she claimed was not communal, despite the fact that she poured cups for everyone and complained if they thanked her too loudly. Caleb helped translate modern digital records into something ordinary people could understand. June Attell from the Millbrook Ledger returned often, not to exploit the story, but to document how a town learned to read its own scars. Bear became the unofficial director of intake. He wore a red and black bandana Mabel had sewn for him, with a small bell stitched in gold thread near the edge. Ethan pretended to disapprove. Bear pretended not to enjoy it. Both were lying. The German shepherd lay beneath the front table, with his torn ear toward the door and his silver muzzle resting on his paws. When someone entered with shaking hands or a face held too still, Bear would rise slowly, walk over, and place his head on their shoe. He did not fix them. That was important. No creature could. But the room changed when Bear made contact, shoulders lowered, breathing eased. Someone would laugh, embarrassed, and say, "Well, hello to you too." Then maybe a folder would open, maybe a story would begin. Maybe only silence would sit with them a while. St. Aldrich became less like an office than a ferry landing. People arrived on one shore carrying the names others had given them: unstable, mistaken, difficult, non-compliant, closed case. They did not cross all at once. Some only came to look at the water. Some turned back. Some returned weeks later. But the place waited. Ethan understood that kind of waiting now. As the third harvest season approached, the belfry remained unsealed. The strange clause that had sounded like a curse at auction had become something else entirely. Elias Rook had not written a riddle for amusement. He had left a breathing space in the law, a narrow passage through which truth might survive long enough for the right hands to find it. Ethan often thought about the engineer pastor in the shelter below, wrapping boxes in oilcloth, writing notes in blue pencil, knowing perhaps that he would not live to see anyone believe him. There was sorrow in that, but there was also stubborn grace. Elias had built a bridge out of delay. On the morning they rang the bell again, the air was bright and cold enough to make every breath visible. Snow still lay in patches across the fields, but the wheat had begun to rise through it, thin green blades pushing into light. Millbrook gathered outside St. Aldrich in coats, gloves, work boots, church shoes, and farm caps. Not a crowd fit for a parade, just enough people to make an abandoned place know it had been remembered. Mabel stood near the steps with a thermos under one arm and eyes suspiciously bright. Nora wore her navy parka and held a level in one gloved hand because, according to her, ceremonies did not exempt anyone from geometry. Caleb stood beside Howard Bell and Dale Pritchard, listening more than speaking. June Attell had her camera lowered for once, as if some moments needed to enter memory before newsprint. Ethan wore his red and black plaid jacket, clean now but still patched at the elbow. His dog tags rested openly over his shirt. He had not planned that. Or perhaps he had, and was not ready to admit it. Bear climbed the tower stairs with him, slowly. The old dog's hips were stiffer than before, and halfway up he paused, breathing hard. Ethan stopped immediately. "We don't have to," he said. Bear looked up at him with an expression of profound insult. "All right," Ethan said. "Your knees, your lawsuit." Step by step, they reached the belfry. The bell hung above them, repaired and dark, its bronze skin bearing old weather marks like a giant's memory. Through the open arches, Ethan could see the fields, the road, the town in the distance, and the places where the proposed interchange had not been built. Not yet. Perhaps not there. Perhaps not over buried truth. Below, the people waited. Ethan placed one hand on the rope. For a moment, he thought of the first time the bell had sounded under Bear's desperate weight, bent, ugly, urgent, dragging the town from sleep. That sound had not been beautiful. It had been necessary. This sound would be different. He pulled. The bell answered clear and deep. It rolled out over the fields, full and round, no longer a wounded groan, but a voice restored. It crossed the snow, the wheat, the old roads, the courthouse, the library, the diner, the tracks beside Nora's house. It passed over the remembered bridges and the roads not yet built. It did not announce victory. Victory was too simple, too proud. It called witness. Ethan pulled again. The second toll opened something in him. He had not gotten his old life back. Some bridges, once collapsed, could not be rebuilt in the same place. His marriage was gone. Certain friends would never return. Some apologies would arrive late, thin, or not at all. The review of his record would take time, and even if it cleared his name, it would not refund the years spent believing he was the fracture. But he was no longer living beneath the report. He stood above it now, in a tower that had refused to be sealed, beside a dog that had refused to leave him, over a church that had refused to fall quietly. Bear leaned against his leg. Ethan looked down and rested his hand on the old shepherd's head. The torn ear lay warm beneath his palm. "You did good," he said. Bear sighed, as if this had been obvious for some time. Ethan laughed softly. Below, the people of Millbrook looked up. Some smiled, some wiped their eyes. Nora pretended to inspect the tower alignment. Mabel did not pretend at all. The bell rang a third time. Its sound moved across the thawing fields, calling back the misnamed, the dismissed, the wrongly filed, the quietly shamed, the ones who had been told their memories were too old to matter. And beneath that white Kansas sky, where winter was loosening its grip but had not yet vanished, Ethan Cole understood at last that healing was not the return of what had been lost. Healing was the building of another bridge, lower, slower, stronger, wide enough for a man, an old dog, and a town full of unfinished stories to cross without pretending the snow had never fallen. Some things in life cannot be rebuilt exactly as they were. A name may be wounded, a home may be lost, a season may leave more snow than we thought we could carry. But God often works through small, faithful things: an old bell, a forgotten place, a loyal dog, a few people brave enough to remember the truth. Ethan did not get every lost year back, but he found peace in choosing not to let pain have the final word. May this story remind us that healing is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply the courage to open the door again, to tell the truth gently, and to keep walking across the bridge that grace has placed before us. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you would like more stories of hope, loyalty, and quiet miracles, consider subscribing to the channel. May peace find you tonight, wherever you are, and may you never forget that even after a long winter, something green can still rise.